We move now to news just in. The presidency has responded to a 9-page letter from 2 senior advocates questioning the constitutionality of the National Coronavirus Command Council. In the letter, the advocates also expressed concerns about the powers that the Command Council wields and whether it represents a constitutional crisis. Joining us now in studio is senior politics reporter Ziyanda Ngcobo. Ziyanda, thanks for joining us. Before we spoke to Advocate Richards, who was really speaking about how boundaries seem to have been overreached. He spoke about how there's a lot of questions about who really is in charge and who's making decisions. We've had some reaction now with news just in. Talk us through these details.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, as you've already mentioned, advocates Aaron Richards and Nazir Kasim wrote a letter to the president on the 27th of April, basically, questioning the legality of the constitution of this National Command Council, the power that this National Command Council wields, and basically raising concern, saying that it seems as though the National Command Council has centralized power, which goes against what has been stipulated in the Disaster Management Act. So now we've got another concern, rather, also that was raised by these 2 advocates, was that this Command Council is only made up of 19 cabinet ministers. Why have the other cabinet ministers been excluded from this Command Council, and why are the Parliament's oversight role, rather, seems to have been usurped by the creation of this National Command Council. The presidency has actually just come back now in a 3-letter response, which has been written by the Director General, Cassius Lubisi, basically saying that the role that has been played by the ministers is one that they would have otherwise played even if they didn't form part of this National Command Council.
And before we go into the details of that, I just want us to go back a little bit and listen to what Advocate Aaron Richards had to say before this.
Sure.
We as lawyers noticed that there was just no information on the National Command Council. We heard ad nauseum about this body, about the decisions that it was taking, but when I started to look for information about the Command Council, I couldn't find it. I had to rely on Barry Bateman, who eventually sourced a tweet off of government's official webpage. And that was the only information that I could find about this body. And that made me raise some serious questions. The decisions around how this pandemic is governed are supposed to be made by the entire cabinet. And we find it perplexing that this Command Council consists of only 19 ministers, which is not the entire cabinet. And we can see no constitutional or statutory basis for the existence of this body, let alone for the powers that it's exercising. And what's more worrying is that the threshold keeps moving. On day one, they're making certain decisions. The next day, they're making different decisions. The next day, they seem to be an advisory body. So there's just absolutely no clarity and no transparency about this body of 19 ministers who, for all intents and purposes, seems to be running the country. So that letter just asks for clarity.
She says the letter asks for clarity, raising a number of concerns. They're saying the body seems to be taking over the role of Parliament. Let's just go back a little bit, Ziyanda, and speak more about what the letter contained and what we're seeing today.
So in the letter, as you've heard from Advocate Aaron Richards, her and Nazir Kasim are in an interesting position because they're both senior counsel, but they're also actually clients in this particular case. And the issue they were raising was, one, whether or not this National Command Council, does it find itself in a constitutional quagmire by virtue of the fact that it isn't a creature of statute, which means which laws are governing the existence of this particular National Command Council, because they were saying, according to the National Disaster Management Act, there's only one minister who's designated to give certain powers and to actually make legislative decisions regarding how the disaster is handled. the presidency has come back and responded to that, saying essentially that cabinet, there's no rules that govern how cabinet organizes itself to do its work. It's also said that in terms of the number of ministers who are part of this National Command Council, because another issue that was raised in that 9-page letter was the fact that not all cabinet ministers form part of the National Command Council. So why isn't the entire executive a part of that? And the presidency has said that, the president decided that it needed to be all those cabinet members who have a role to play in the management of this particular disaster. And essentially, the presidency is saying that these two lawyers who question this don't actually understand how government works, and how there is actually a separation of powers between the judiciary, the legislature and the executive, saying that the role of parliament and its oversight role, which was another concern that was raised by these lawyers, to say, well, opposition parties, for an example, aren't able to do oversight role, especially when you look at how, the Solidarity Fund is meant to dispense funds during this time. Basically, the presidency saying, well, there's nothing particularly different with what's happening now, because Parliament still can conduct its oversight role, and in actual fact, this is just a reconfiguration of how the executive operates, and also it's like any other council that exists. I think, Paul, the issue that may still need to be responded to, which was another key issue raised by the advocates, was why the Command Council seems to have, legislative powers. So as in the powers that are meant to only rest with Minister Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, it seems all the other ministers have that, and they're actually now also giving credence to how the regulations should work, because their argument, the lawyers that is that this National Command Council should merely play an advisory role and not one where they're also now forming part of how the legislation and the regulations should work.
When it comes to issues of transparency, that was also something that was raised quite strongly by the lawyers. What did the president respond to that?
Sure, it was the issue of transparency and accountability as well, to say, the decisions taken by this National Command Council, if there's something that happens, who will be held accountable for those particular actions, whether or not they prove to be good or bad. And also another issue was what they believed seemed to be the erosion of the people's voice, that you have just a small group of people making decisions on behalf of the people without their particular voice. I'm just going to read a paragraph from the response from the presidency, and it says, as for the accountability to Parliament, the Minister of Health reported to the Portfolio Committee on Health on the 10th of April, and since the 21st of April, ministers have been accounting to the public, to Parliament, at the relevant Portfolio Committee. So essentially, it's going back to the presidency's response to say that, these lawyers don't seem to understand how cabinet works and how the three tiers of the state work, because if they did, they would know that Parliament is still conducting its oversight role through the various portfolio committees that exist, and that in fact this National Command Council consists of the various ministers who are relevant to the various responses. So Minister of Transport would deal, for an example, with the movement of people and how that goes about, as well as you would have with the Minister of Home Affairs, and that it's just a reconfiguration of the executive, and really the DG saying that there are no rules that exist in terms of directing cabinet and how it sets up or sets out to do its work.
Do we see, or perhaps preempt, these lawyers taking this matter lying down and just leaving it as is, or is there some sort of response that we can expect from them?
So up until a short while ago, because the letter had actually given the presidency a deadline of up to until yesterday, they had actually said that they're planning to file court papers. But now that this response has come in, I've spoken to the instructing attorney in the matter, and he says that they will be reviewing the response by the presidency, and then they will decide whether or not they still want to continue with litigation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Let's leave it there. Our politics senior editor, Ziyanda Ngcobo, they're just giving us a breakdown of our breaking news, with Presidency now responding to the lawyers that had written about the concerns about the constitutional and statutory authority of the National Coronavirus Command Council.